Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. And on this week's episode, we're going to be looking at a series of cases that, like all of them, are very, very strange. And the first one I want to talk about today is the strange case of Bronte Lloyd. Now, he was a South Australian farmer who had the most unusual misfortune or fortune to have two strange encounters in the same month in 1987 on his remote farm north of Adelaide in South Australia. Now, interestingly enough, this is the same year that some very strange encounters in the northwestern Mallee region of Victoria in the west, Turif farm case of Max and Nancy Jolly, which I've done an episode on previously. So this is in the same year in the neighbouring state. So 1987 appeared to have been a very active year in the ufology activity here in Australia. So farmers certainly do have their fair share of strange events. And this one tonight that we're going to discuss certainly does fit that description. So what does it have? It has strange lights in the sky. It has landing traces. It has disturbed animals. And it has, interestingly enough, fluctuations in space and time. It has entities. And it also has physical interaction with a farmhouse, fear and terror attached and associated to the experience with the experiencer. It has energy effects. And it also has a really good description of a UFO. And it has a farmer who was physically examined by non-human entities and mentally forever affected by that experience. So it all sounds really incredible, and it is. So the strange case of Bronte Lloyd stands as another intriguing and unexplained example of unexplained phenomena in Australia. And we'll have a good look at what actually happened in this very intriguing case. So Mr. Bronte Lloyd, he was 52 years old at the time of this encounter, and he was a cattle farmer at the small town of Spalding, which is north of Adelaide. And at the time living with him, he had his wife and two sons. And we'll just have a bit of a look at, for a bit of orientation, exactly where the location is. So I'm just going to go down here. So there we go. So that is actually where Adelaide is in the centre of the map. You can see that where that little red dropper is, that's the area of Spalding. And so we'll go in a little bit closer and have another look there. There you go. It's a small place. So doesn't have a lot of people there, only a few hundred people live in that little town. And his house is another 20 kilometres up the road north. So the property is out in the wide open spaces, and it doesn't have anything around it other than a few neighbours that are sort of, a little bit further away as well. So very, very isolated location. And this one sort of shows you going from Spalding, which is at the bottom of the map, and in that red area there, and then those little white line moves up to the location where the farm is. So it's a very, very remote location. And UFOs, they commonly appear in those types of areas. So the encounter occurred at his property in June 1987 with what he described as alien beings from an unidentified flying object. That's his words. And from his encounter, he received mysterious dark brown scars on his face that would not go away. In fact, they didn't go away. To my knowledge, they stayed with him his entire life. And he was not worried about many skeptics and critics who were eager to debunk his story. He was far more concerned about ongoing and living with the fact that he'd had this encounter. He was concerned about reliving the events, or the PTSD effects of it, and trying to get some sort of understanding or meaning as to what these weird events, why they happened to him during these 2 nights in July 1987. So the farm lies off a dirt track, and it's about, as I said, 20 kilometres north of the town of Spalding. And he was in his bedroom when the first event took place. And he described it as he was lying in bed, and it was as though time and space were suddenly suspended. So time and space were suddenly suspended. And he was aware of pitch black, total blackness and freezing cold. Isn't that interesting? And he couldn't move, and he thought he was actually having a heart attack. And not even his digital alarm clock that sat next to the bed was visible. And he felt himself floating upwards and felt something being pushed against either side of his cheeks. And he battled against whatever it was that was pinning him down. And he tried to reach for the light switch and to brush away the pressure against his cheeks that he had here. And he knew that something was close by to him, and that it was moving back and forwards, just out of his reach. He blacked out, and when he woke up, he regained the use of one arm, and he reached up in pitch blackness and pulled the object off his face. And he continued to battle against whatever it was that was pinning him down. And when he awoke later, he was able to move normally and look for whatever had been stuck against his face. He searched the room, but he found nothing and returned to bed. And he noticed that his wife, who was a really light sleeper, had not stirred at all during or after the incident. So Bronte thought it best to put it out of his mind, and he went back to sleep. Amazingly, he went back to sleep. I can have a nightmare and not go back to sleep, but he's had a really intense experience and he went back to sleep. Or maybe that was part of the effect as well. Maybe there's that sort of sedative type influence that can rise and fall when you've had these type of experiences. Now, the next morning, he woke and he was feeling groggy, sick, uneasy, not well. And he went into the bathroom and he went to shave. And he noticed that he had pinpricks on either side of his cheeks, these holes here and here. And he also had 2 holes or 2 marks here along the side of either side of his nose. And within the day, these pinpricks had grown to be 1 centimetre across. And within a week, they were large blotches, probably the size of a strawberry. And plus his face had swollen so badly, he was barely recognisable. as being Bronte. He's had quite a physical reaction to this pressure that's been put on his cheeks here and also on the bridge of his nose. And his family was concerned for his health, and as you would be, and he went to the doctor. And the doctor referred him to a specialist who was simply and utterly, completely baffled by what had caused the marks and what they could even possibly be. What could these marks be? He didn't know what these marks were. And so Bronte had never experienced anything like this before, and I don't think too many people have. And he had no beliefs in UFOs or paranormal. He was a South Australian farmer, plenty in the real world to keep you occupied when you're running a cattle farm north of Adelaide, I'm sure. So, and he struggled to find words and to come to grips with this time out that he called it. He called it the time out period that he had, where time, space, it all stood still for him, and he just, he couldn't reconcile this. And he said that he could cope with droughts and floods, but he could not fathom this first night's experience, which had left him staring at that mirror in horror and aghast at these extremely visible pinpricks, marks on either side of his cheeks. So, and the resulting blowing up of them and his actual face as well. So, but that wasn't the end of the story. In fact, that's just the beginning of the strange case of Bronte Lloyd. That's just the beginning. And that's an experience in and of itself that would be enough for you to never forget that in an entire lifetime. But 3 weeks later, on July 27th, what happened then was even more alarming. And that night had him terrified. For Bronte believed that whatever it had been had now come back. And on this particular day, it was approaching dusk, and Bronte and his son-in-law were seeding and ploughing one of his fields when a bright red light appeared up in the sky, and then it skimmed down to hover over a clump of trees about 1 kilometre away, and it shone a bright light down over this clump of eucalyptus trees or gum trees for a short time. And Bronte said, "I am familiar with aircraft lights. This was nothing like that. It hovered and then it flew away." Now, Bronte's son-in-law became nervous and started packing up and heading home. But Bronte, being the stoic, dedicated farmer that he is or was, stayed to finish the job, as he wanted it done before heading inside for the night. Otherwise, you ought to come back the next day and the work's just waiting for you, isn't it? So he's made the decision to continue working. And he did some more laps of the field on the tractor, but he started to feel nervous for some reason, and he did not know why suddenly the beam of light appeared again. But this time it was a lot closer than before. And again, it was over another clump of trees closer to his location. And it hovered for a while and then disappeared. At this point in time, Bronte decided that it was time to finish the seeding for the day and go home, and ultimately decided to commence again the next day. So this is the start of day 2 of the adventure. The paddock is being seeded. This strange red light has appeared twice over the field. Once was enough to scare off the son-in-law. The second time was enough to make an uneasy Bronte decide that yes, perhaps it's best to pack it up for the day. And when he arrived home, he discovered that his wife had gone to his son-in-law's house and Bronte was alone. And in fact, his son Gary had gone to the golf club, and his other son wasn't home either. So Bronte was the only person at the house. And Bronte left the tractor running, went inside, turned on some lights. And he had not been home long when the first thing he noticed was that the dogs started to go berserk, absolutely berserk. Now, when your dogs are going berserk, there is something outside, because if anyone has got a dog, and farm dogs particularly, they are very territorially protective of their home, and they are the best security alarm system you can just about have. And birds are good too. So the dogs went berserk, and he'd never seen them acting that way. And they jumped into the air, and then they cowered, jumped up into the air, and then they cowered again. And when Bronte looked outside, he could see there was something near a clump of trees. So 50 metres from Bronte Lloyd's back door was a grove of 12 trees. And I've got a picture here so this is the type of the location. The trees are around the house, and you've got this sort of distance away. And those dogs are going crazy. So 50 metres, there's the grove of trees. Now, beneath the grove of trees was a shining craft, 4 metres in diameter. And at first, Bronte thought it was a parked car. And he was momentarily amazed that how a car could be parked in that fenced off location. Who could have possibly put a car in there? As this object was in the middle of the clump of trees. And he started to walk towards the location. And as the dogs continued to howl, he crept closer still. And now he was aware, at this point in time, that he was looking, indeed, at a flying saucer in his yard. It was round, a shining aluminium colour, with struts on the ground. It was 2.5 metres tall and 3.5 metres wide. It was rounded with portholes all around the side, and it had 3 headlights. So that's definitely a flying saucer. And it all came down to a small square base and had stabilizers on the side. So it's quite a good description. So shining aluminium in colour, struts on the ground, 2.5 metres tall, 3.5 metres wide, rounded portholes, 3 headlights, all coming down to a small square base with stabilizers. And it was just sitting there. No noise, no movement. And the lights had been turned off. Now, he got quite close to it, which is interesting that he able to get so close. But then he fled back into the house. He decided, I'm going back to the house. And he scrambled for a torch. And he found one. But the batteries in it were flat. And he tried to find batteries for it as well. So it's interesting to note that whether the torch might have just been flat, or maybe the presence of the object had drained the power out of the batteries, among other possibilities. But this is all in the heat of the moment and very hard to pinpoint. And then from his front door, he saw his dogs surrounding and barking at something near the trees. Now, the dogs had cornered someone in the darkness, and the dogs were leaping and snapping at whoever they had corralled up. And due to the corner of the house, Bronte could not quite see who or what they were snapping at. And he tried to get a better view. And as he tried to get a better view, the dog's demeanour changed to abject terror. So one ran away into the field, another hid in a pile of boxes, and the third dog ran to him and cowered behind him. And like Bronte, like the dogs, was terrified and retreated back inside and locked the door. So these dogs have been snapping and barking at something, and then in an instant, the terror has hit the dogs, and the dogs have just scattered to the wind. So good, brave little dogs or farm dogs trying to protect the property and their master, and they've been terrified. So Bronte's back in the house at this stage, and he's locked the door. And in the meanwhile, his family was at a nearby property, and he called them on the telephone, but they were too scared to come home. And he slumped into a lounge chair. His poor old dad, all on his own in the house, with something really weird going on, and no one else wanting to come around and save him or help him. And the next thing that terrified him was footsteps going from the house corner towards the front door. Now, to Bronte, the steps seemed to be receding, and he wondered what was. So the steps had been coming towards, and he heard the steps moving back again. And he went into the bathroom, and he said he wouldn't forget these steps. He said they were short, close together, and strangely sounded like someone walking in or on plastic. So these footsteps that he could hear outside, my special effects there, sounded like these footsteps were short steps, close together, which would perhaps indicate a smaller being, perhaps, rather than a larger creature. And it sounded like they were walking in or on plastic. And I think a bubble wrap or something like that. Or it could be sheets of plastic. It's that type of sound. And he'd gone back and sat in the chair, staring at the door. And he wasn't going to open the door. He was just simply scared stiff. And he heard the back door open. He heard the back door open. And I find this a really interesting point in this particular incident. One of the lights flicked on. So the back door's opened and the lights flicked on. So presumably he's locked the door and the light's off. Now the door's open and the light has flicked on. At first, he had a bit of relief come over him because he assumed that his son Gary had returned home from the golf club. And as Bronte entered the hall, he saw that it was not Gary. And Bronte was aware that the being or entity had entered the house, because when this light flicked on and he got out of the chair and he moved into the corridor and he saw what he described as a speckled blur in the passageway, a speckled blur, like a shadow, but also different to a shadow. And it was standing there. And Bronte walked towards this shadow and it retreated towards the back door. And he could hear the door latch being turned. And as he arrived in the entrance area, he was there just in time to see a shape drift out into the night. Now, isn't that a really sort of a scary type of encounter when you've got this shadow type entity or being, or even perhaps some type of a camouflage type of an effect on it? I think of the Predator movies, that type of thing. Maybe it was something like that. He's described it as a speckled blur, a shadow but not a shadow. So this is obviously some type of technology or some type of creature that is beyond a 52-year-old South Australian farmer's ability to even put into words. So he couldn't just even find a description to match that. So, and then he ran outside and found himself roughly in the same area where the dogs had run off, and he came back inside again, locked the door, and he felt really tired, and he sat down in the chair and just waited for something to happen. Now, the next thing he knew, it was 1:30 a.m. So this would have all been occurring around about 6 o'clock at night, this whole incident. And by the time each thing rolled out in sequence, it probably wouldn't have been much later than that. That whole sequence of events might have only taken 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe that. But the next thing, it was 1:30 and he was laying in bed. And he was being awakened by members of his family who had overcome their fear and returned to the farm. So Bronte said, the next thing I remember is lying in my bed, my family were around me, and I had been in a deep sleep. So he doesn't overly remember going to sleep. So that's interesting as well, isn't it? Like, perhaps the whole experience has sapped him of his entire energy, or he has been put into some type of a trance by the entities that had appeared. And even the entity in the doorway, in the doorway appearing and then going outside again, it's kind of almost like they only want to interact with him when he's unconscious, rather than a human who's conscious could have presented some danger to the entities as well. Like a male gorilla would present dangers to humans if you were trying to interact with it. Maybe it's the same for them as well. So, and after he'd awoken, he instructed the family to go see if the object was still parked over by and in amongst the clump of trees. And the family was afraid to go outside. And around this time, there was a downpour of rain also. And it was the only one for that night, downfall of rain. And it left an outline of the craft on the ground. In the morning, some footprints could be seen in one spot, which the family assumed was where the door of the craft had been located, where these footprints had appeared. Now, I don't have any pictures of this, which is really frustrating and annoying, that there's actually quite limited resources available on this case, but that's what I like. I like these cases that don't have a lot on them, or that are almost that lost to time now, that these incidences are being pretty much forgotten. So that's why I like talking about these encounters, because this is a really, really good, high quality encounter with a credible witness, with all those trace effects and animal disturbances and time and space and marks on the face. It's just got everything. So it's an absolutely brilliant case. And like a lot of these Australian cases, they are really being lost and forgotten to time, only known by a few researchers who've got information on the cases. Researchers have passed away who worked on this case. So it's important that this stuff is found and talked about, and so if people watch these podcasts in the future, they can look up this information themselves rather than being completely unaware of it. So this case certainly deserves that level of preservation, because it's a high quality series of events. So they'd found this area on the ground with footprints, and the police were called, and Senior Constable Peter Bates of the Jamestown Police Department. Jamestown is the next town north of Spalding. So Bronte's property was sort of in between Spalding and Jamestown. So Senior Constable Peter Bates of the Jamestown Police Department arrived at the farm and spoke to Bronte and the family, and he conducted a search of the area. And the officer was able to find and confirm what the family had found. There was a flattened area and a border of grass about the width of a car tyre, about 1.5 metres square. It was really clear that despite the rain earlier in that night, a large object had disturbed the ground beneath the clump of eucalyptus trees. Something heavy had set down in that area, creating the impression on the ground. And Senior Constable Peter Bates said that he had known Bronte Lloyd for 3 years and he had absolutely no reason whatsoever to doubt him. And after further checking in the area, the police confirmed that no other neighbours had seen lights or noticed anything unusual on that particular evening. So it was kind of like a relatively isolated event at his farm. But these farms aren't that close to each other either. So it's not like it's a suburban neighbourhood where you've got people all living in close proximity in an urban environment. This is farms with large distances between properties, or at least several kilometres between properties. So it'd be quite possible for an event to occur in one location and not have additional witnesses, which is still unfortunate, but the case has got enough solid evidence around it. So Bronte Lloyd, he locked the experience away within his head, and the secrets of the encounter, he believes, remained in his head. So, and he started to feel that an alien force may have used him as a guinea pig, you know. So, you know, and he's left with these. Not only has he had this experience, the poor guy's left with these really distinct marks that remain on his face for the rest of his life. You know, so you know, it basically. What the other strange thing about it too was he'd have one large brown patch on his skin, and it's like it's beneath the skin. So it was almost like it was under the skin, not actually on the skin. The skin layer above it was there. And then when one of them shrinks down, the other one spreads. So one shrinks and then the other one spreads. And Bronte considered undergoing hypnosis. And it's sort of, you know, it seemed to be a potential way to unlock the secrets that had remained hidden in his experience. And he thought that he should have called the police immediately, because the police had obviously turned up the next day. And he said, "I feel the only mistake I made that night, the thing landed, was in not calling the police immediately. You realise after these things that you should or could have reacted differently. But fright confuses you. There is more to this whole thing, and I want to find out what really happened. I must." So he's been distressed by this, and he said that, you know, that fear totally confuses you and rattles you in every way, and that's very true. If you're experiencing fear on that level, you just can't think in a rational way. It's the flight or fight that kicks in. So. And I reckon he's dealt with it in a braver manner as he possibly could. You know, he's home alone. This strange craft and entity appears. He's on the second encounter. He's done what anyone could have done. You know, like he did well under those circumstances. And ultimately, the family, the police, and the community all moved on. But for Bronte, this was impossible. And he contacted Colin Norris of the Adelaide-based organisation. This is a really long UFO name. And the organisation was called the Australian International UFO Flying Saucer Research Organisation. That's one hell of a name. And Colin Norris visited the location, and he spoke to the family, and he interviewed Bronte extensively. Hypnotism was again discussed as an option to unlocking the missing information. And Bronte also began to attend meetings and discovered that other people in his area had had experiences as well. Another local woman had described being levitated out of her bed, and she had a triangular mark on her body. And other farmers that Bronte knew, and he began to refer to it as being branded. So other farmers in the area had also had these type of encounters. Now, a biochemist called Tom Coote, He took interest in Bronte's case, and he thought it may have been linked to a lupus-type condition. And he took samples from Bronte and discovered anomalies in his electrolyte levels. And unfortunately, Bronte passed away before any more analysis could be undertaken. And Tom Coote was convinced that something unnatural had happened to Bronte over those 2 nights in July 1987. So we're going to have a bit of a look. Got a couple of other photos here. So this is a shot of the area where the UFO had been in the clump of trees. That's an actual photo in that area. So quite a dense clump of trees. And this is Bronte with his actual marks on his face. So that's the poor farmer. And you can see that quite clearly he's got 2 red marks on either cheek, or brown marks, not so much red marks, but brown marks. They look like birthmarks almost in that picture. And it's a shame that it's a black and white image, because if it was colour, you'd probably get a better sense of the colouring. But it was described as a brown colour. And you can see on his nose, he also has got the 2 marks horizontally across the bridge of his nose as well. And those blotches would shrink and grow. And he was basically, as he said, branded for life after he'd had that encounter. So that's the strange case of Bronte Lloyd. Really fascinating event. And it's a shame that he's passed away, because I'd love to talk to him about what happened to him, and and see what the long-term effect is of these encounters as well. That's why these encounters that we're talking about are old encounters 30-40 years ago. And in that time, it's more than enough time to pass for people to unfortunately pass away. So unfortunately, that's what's happened to Bronte. He's no longer with us. But that encounter was really incredible. Now, interestingly enough, there's another town sort of south of Spalding, and this town is called Clare. And I'll just show you a quick shot of that. So that's Clare. So you'd go from Adelaide, you'd drive through Clare, and then you'd drive up to Spalding, and then you'd go on to Jamestown. So again, not a large place. Now, an incident occurred in Clare, just down the road from Bronte's place, and it's about an hour away from Spalding, that area. Now, in July 1989, a couple of years after Bronte's experience, a gentleman called Stephen Langman, who was a justice of the peace, so respected community member, he was awoken at night by a very bright white glow from an object on a lounge chair in the same room in his bedroom. So here's this very bright light sitting on a lounge chair. And the time was 5:40 a.m. And instead of getting up to inspect the light, he lay there in bed watching it. That's interesting, isn't it? And he saw that his feet and the feet of his wife were glowing through the blankets and a doona they had over them. Their feet were glowing through the bedding. He moved one foot, and the glow moved in response to his movement. And he said it was as though the light, or whatever was controlling it, moved in response to his movement. And he said he felt like that the light was examining their feet. And he awoke his wife, Fiona, and she reacted just as calmly. And she too observed the foot glowing phenomena. Then suddenly the light and the glow vanished. And when he was asked what they did then, Mr. Langman replied, "We went back to sleep." So that's interesting, isn't it? Like, and maybe that is a reaction of these encounters. Like, you go into a sleep after you've had this encounter. You don't leap out of bed and, oh my God, and go crazy. You go back to sleep. They weren't disturbed by the experience. It didn't scare them. It was just an odd thing that was occurring. And Fiona added that we were not frightened at the time, but a few months afterwards, she had terrible difficulty in sleeping, and she was scared to sleep. Yet she had been able to sleep right after the incident. So I've never heard of such an encounter like this before, where feet where people have been laying in bed and some object has been shining a light onto their feet, and as they move their feet, it's examining their feet. It's you can't say that that the aliens over the decades have not been interested in humans and human anatomy and our reproductive ability, and they know more about us than we know really very little about them. So this is an interesting case, and it really sort of dovetails well into Bronte's experience as well. But again, this is all relatively limited information available. So this is a couple of news reports, a couple of minor reports that still are preserved in numerous journals and things like that. But principal witnesses have passed away, or and I could spend a lot of time trying to track people down as well. But that takes time, and at least we can capture the basics of what actually occurred in this particular incident. And that era, 1987, 1988, was when the Knowles family's car was lifted off the Nullarbor Highway which was a very famous case here in Australia, and I did do an episode on that previously. So that's all occurred. So you've got the Mundrabilla Knowles family incident. You've got the West Tura farm, where they had very strange occurrences on that farm as well, with strange noises, crop impressions in the wheat. You had sheep being herded into a corner of a paddock by a big bright yellow light. You had an eagle walking around on the grounds, dazed and stunned by that experience. That was in 1987, Mundrabilla 1988. And then you've got Bronte Lloyd, winter of 1987, and the foot examining episode in Clare in 1989. So that was and that's across 3 states, and that's just 3 really good cases. And there's many more, but that's just 3 really good cases that shows that sort of 2-year period around that time was another area of high UFO activity. And I just think, like in the modern era, in the 21st century, we've not seen this type of high quality flap events occurring in this period. I wonder why. It's been unfortunate. I've always just wish I was had been born in 3 decades earlier, and then I would have been able to investigate some of these great cases at the time. And it's a little drier in the 21st century. And so what I'm talking about is like good physical trace evidence cases where you've got animal disturbance, you've got trace evidence on the ground, you've got all that high quality interaction. That's what we're not seeing as much of in this time. There's still UFO reports and UFO events, but sort of the high interaction stuff doesn't seem to be as consistent as it has been in previous decades. So I've just got another little case to talk about. which is another interesting little one that might just round us out for this episode. And this is called the Churchill Park Drive incident, which is in Melbourne, Victoria. So I've got some photos of that too. I'll just bring that up. So Churchill Park Drive. So this is Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And just down to the southeast in that picture, you can see a little purple line. That is in fact the road Churchill Park Drive. And we'll go zoom in a little closer. And this is it a little bit closer. And that's the length of the road there. And it passes through remaining what you would call the Churchill National Park. That's the remaining part of forest in that area, because that's such a highly built out area now. Melbourne's spread out so far, and it's spread out beyond that area too. But Listerfield, that area there to the right, that Listerfield Lake, that's all in the area where Kelly Cahill had her famous encounter just off to the east of Listerfield here. So this is all right in the same area as the Kelly Cahill encounter, very close by. So, and Listerfield Lake, I understand, has had its fair share of UFO reports and encounters around that lake area. So this road here, Churchill Park Drive, that's the location for what we're about to discuss in this particular case. There we go. Turn that off. So what happened? On Churchill Park Drive in Dever Hills, Victoria, at 9:15 p.m. on October the 9th, 1989. There you go. So, as I've just been talking about those years, 87, 88, 89, here we go, October 9th, 1989. October's interesting too, because that's the month that Fred Valentich disappeared in 1978. So October and April are, I reckon, the 2 months, and September, they occur a lot in UFO reports. Not sure of the significance, but it's quite common. So two women in a car, 9:15 at night, in springtime, observed an orange-red UFO off the road, initially at a distance of about 840 metres. And it was situated on the ground and in amongst the trees. Now, they lost sight of it as they passed under high power transmission lines. And then they saw it again. This time it was off the ground and starting to climb in altitude, up and over the power lines. And then apparently crossing over the car as it passed over the road. It then flew away at high speed to the northeast. So the other interesting thing about it too is that this orange-red UFO is also a colour, again, similarly associated to the Kelly Cahill encounter. She saw a big football field UFO that had orange-red coloured lights on that as well. That was 1993, a few years later. But it brings me back to this area as being this sort of Narre Warren, Pakenham, Endeavour Hills. That area does seem, in Melbourne, southeast, does seem to be a really active UFO area. And I almost would consider it to have some sort of portal, or there's some reason why there's a lot of UFO reports and encounters. And these are only just a couple that have come out of that area, and there's plenty more that I don't even know about. So it's has been and is an active UFO zone. People see strange lights out there on a regular basis. So, and it never makes the news. So, it's quite incredible, even with all those phones that are out there. So they've been driving along. This thing's just risen up and sort of banked away, gone over the power lines and taken off. That's pretty much the extent of the encounter. And former Viewforce investigator and John Orcatel first started looking for any possible traces on the 13th of October, 1989. So the incident occurred on the 9th. and a few days later on the 13th. And he searched a 3 square kilometre area around there. And on the 17th of October, a single 12-foot ring was found at the bottom of the hill near the road. And the surrounding ring was about 8 to 10 centimetres wide. And 4 holes were present within the ring, along with various other effects. And testing suggested that the yellowed grass inside the ring was caused by intense or massive amounts of UV radiation had caused this. So he did well to find it, really, when you're considering that he searched a 3 square kilometre area, and eventually, over a series of days, was able to track down a strange impression. So we'll have a bit of a look at the area. So I went up and down this road on Google Maps, and this is the hill. In fact, it's the only hill that I think qualifies for being where the location was, because to the left there is high power transmission towers and the big cables that take the power into Melbourne. And these pictures have to be in the area of that location, because you can see this bend around, the cars coming around in the centre, and you can see those high tower transmission cables that basically bring the power in from the Latrobe Valley into Melbourne. And I think that's another interesting aspect about this case, is the fact that this thing has been seen near the power lines. They're quite attracted to our power sources. And that would be pretty much the location where the ladies had driven under at that time. And this is approaching it from the other direction, from the north. So you can see those transmission lines go directly over the road, high power over there. And this map here also shows, you can see the lines travelling across there where the power lines are. You've got Churchill Park Drive coming down, and just down at the bottom centre picture there, at the bottom of the hill, in that area there, is down where he discovered this actual impression on the ground. So again, 1989, that sort of time frame. It's just a small case, just something to finish off with, but again, it's interesting. I just find these little snippets of information as I go looking around, and sometimes there's images, sometimes there's not. But part of the challenge for me is I thoroughly enjoy getting onto Google Maps and tracking down this information and looking for it, seeing if I can find the location. Now, I walked along that road from top of it to the bottom of it on Google Maps, and the geography checks out with it. And that has to be the area where that occurred, in amongst the trees. That's where the national park area is. So that's the obvious area to look. And that's all part of the fun of digging out these events and trying to get close to them. I don't live near any of these locations, so I can't just hop in the car and, that one's 3 hours away, that location. So, which is achievable, but the South Australian locations that is just unachievable. You can't go do that on a weekend. You just can't jump in the car and drive to Spalding, South Australia from East Gippsland, Victoria. It would take me 3 days to get there, just in driving. So the best we can do is hop on Google Maps and see what we can find. And I still live in hope too that at some point in time I'll find remnants of a circle or an impression still visible on Google Maps. I haven't found it yet, and unfortunately for me, the more you zoom in on Google Maps, the resolution drops away a lot, so you don't get a high res image as you zoom in. But it still enables us to visit the areas and have a look at these locations. So anyway, thank you for joining me again on another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. I hope you enjoyed the strange case of Bronte Lloyd and the case from Clare, and also Churchill Park Drive. And I look forward to seeing you again next week when we will continue our search for more strange and unusual Australian paranormal events. Have a great night, and I'll see you then.